Thank you everyone for joining us. This is a part of our new monthly series, which will be taking place the third Thursday of each month. The purpose of the show is to bring manufacturing and supply chain leaders together to discuss the importance of post PO management topics. And today's session is all about how manufacturers can generate real cost savings from expanded PO management. Now, from the audience, would love to hear where you're from, which manufacturer you're from, and where you're joining us from. I think we have a predominantly UK audience today, so please drop us a message. Would love to hear more. Now, our first question, as a way of doing an introduction, my first question is for Alex. Alex, if you could give us an intro and your answer to the following question. What does your pre-PO process look like, and what does your post-PO process look like?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, just a quick introduction of myself. My name's Alex Hardwick. I'm currently the Group Head of Procurement and Supply Chain for Avic Cabin Systems UK. And I'm also an advisor for the guys over at Kavita. So I've worked on the product with them over the past 9 months or so to get it where it is today. Um, in terms of my pre-PO process right now, there's two streams. There's one which is a first time buy where you have to go through the process of obtaining a quote, obtaining approval, making sure you're on budget, and then going through the actual PO approval process. And then the second stream is repeat buy, where generally you've got an existing cost, an existing supplier in place, and it's just simply a case of placing the purchase order and acknowledging internal approval for that. In terms of post PO process, this is where it gets extremely complicated for us. We have in the region of 7,000 purchase order lines live right now. Each one of those is managed predominantly through a manual process, with some automated order books being sent to suppliers and then feedback coming in, but manual updates taking place. So, unfortunately for us, that post PO process is extremely long winded.
Thanks, Alex. Natasha, I would love an introduction from yourself and the same question. What does your pre-PO process look like, and what does your post-PO process look like?
Thanks, Anam. So I'm Natasha Brown. I'm the Group Procurement Director for Harland and Wolff. We are a shipbuilding and heavy manufacturing industry. Harland and Wolff is primarily known for building the Titanic. It was fine when it left Belfast. But other than shipbuilding and ship repair, we're also responsible for making jackets on monopiles that go into the seabed for lots of wind turbines. So we have a huge focus on oil and gas and renewables. We're very conscious of that side of things as well. The common theme throughout all our different businesses, though, is manufacturing and the output of that. Prior to joining Harland and Wolff, I worked at UCL, so very much in education. Before that, I worked for a company called Johnson Matthey. I've got a history in public and private sector, defence, aeronautical, IT and telecoms. So there was a plan, but I'm not sure quite what it was originally on that one. In terms of where we are now, I'd say we're a relatively new business. Harland and Wolff in its current constituents only really started in 2019. We're a very old established brand, but shipbuilding in the UK has been through a lot of difficulties. We're in the middle of a transition from very much a purchasing organisation to procurement. Exactly as Alex said, we follow the same process with our ERP for sourcing, trying to set suppliers up. It's all done via the ERP. When it comes to post PO, though, that's when life gets interesting. We, for major projects, have some subcontract management, and there's been a bit of debate as to where that role sits, whether it's in commercial, within projects, or within procurement. I would say it should sit within procurement. And from my perspective, the people who negotiate the subcontract should be the people that are ultimately responsible for delivering it, because you've got a vested interest in it. For me, it's very much looking at the reporting, the KPIs. Primarily, are we delivering on time? Are we delivering on schedule? The joy of earned value reporting. I do love a good cost performance and schedule performance indicator. As Alex said again, trying to pull all of that together at the moment is incredibly mandrolic and very labour intensive. It's also difficult when you have people doing things manually because you can't ensure necessarily consistency. So it's why it's worth so much spending so much time with your ERP to get that into the system where you can, so you can automate that. We're probably further behind than Alex at the moment, though, in that we don't have a variety of different platforms at the moment. One of the things we'd like to get to is an e-marketplace that will then make life a lot easier, certainly on consumables and things like that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Natasha. And that's such a cool story. You're at the company that built Titanic. How many people can say that?
Not very many.
No, no, cool. Ewan, would love an introduction and your answer to does your pre-PO process look like and what does your post-PO process look like?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Ewan Granger. Currently I'm a supply chain manager for Morgan Sindall Construction in the UK. My experience is heavily within manufacturing. Got about 15 years or so in procurement and supply chain. About 2/3 of that has been in manufacturing through public procurement, defence, and some more recently down to things like subsea manufacturing and things that actually probably tie in with some of the stuff that Natasha's company are producing as well, some way down the line too. So I think I've had plenty of experience placing POs in the past. I think as a company at the moment, Morgan Sindall's, we've got quite a convoluted pre-PO placement process where we have all of our suppliers and subcontractors pre-approved, and I think we've got at least 2 or 3 systems that have to be kind of aligned to allow us to do this. Once we have that, then we can go out. We get 4 prices on any package that we're doing within a construction project. Alongside that, we have a central procurement team who manage our day-to-day site procurement. So they have a list of pre-approved suppliers that they can then go and place orders with. So there's almost orders that are managed regionally, and there's also stuff that's managed centrally as well. So that's slightly complicated. And then when you get to the post-PO management, you are still managing against budgets and things, but much as Alex has said, is still a very labour intensive process. Any changes to costs or detail or anything like that is done through our system, and then that has to be communicated back to the party at the other end of the PO. So it does rely heavily on a decent level of communication for people to make sure that message gets put across, but also that it is communicated in a kind of relatively timely fashion. So there's that there, and then with I suppose with the usual kind of like PO management systems, ERPs, centrally everything's then tied off so that people can get paid. But I think we find ourselves tripping over the technology more often than not, which is perhaps not what it was put in place to do. It's maybe not helping us in the way that we'd intended.
Brilliant, thanks Ewan. So the rest of the conversation is going to be focused on opportunities in post-PO management. And for procurement to be strategic, they must deliver strategic objectives. Cost savings right now is a major focus for every company due to the economic downturn, due to decline in demand, and a whole list of other reasons. My first question for Natasha. Natasha, what does cost savings mean to you, and how do you track cost savings at Harland & Wolff?
So for me, I think cost savings, you've got 2 separate strands. You've got the direct. A supplier comes to you and says it's going to cost 100. You have a negotiation with them following market benchmarking, following competition, and you're able to prove that you saved 10 because you secured that for 90, for example. We're very old-fashioned at the moment. We're capturing that manually in a spreadsheet. The other side of savings for me, though, is very much around the indirect and more the cost avoidance. So, how do you mitigate a planned increase? How do you mitigate potentially unforeseen costs? But I think one of the things within procurement we tend to do is focus on a very literal definition of cost saving. And I think it's more important to look at cost savings in the context of value for money, whole life cycle costs. And for a long time, there's been a school of thought around, well, look at the cost of purchase. So quite often the capex, especially in Ewan's world, working with Morgan Sindall. But then also, well, what's the cost of running that? You might save, for argument's sake, 10% on the cost of your capital, but discover that that's more expensive to run. So actually the 5-year life cycle, 10-year life cycle is so much more. But then what we're trying to do is look at, well, what's the availability? How reliable is what you're buying? So what are you saving by something not being down, not being unavailable, and you're having to bring alternatives in, or potentially lost revenue because you haven't got this available? But the bit that is getting really exciting now for me is looking at the broader side of it, so the CO2 side. So what's your carbon footprint? What carbon savings are you saving via all of this? And it's getting people to look at it more holistically. So it's almost that fourth dimension. And for me, procurement needs to be capturing all of those different angles. And it's quite hard for a lot of more traditional teams because they're used to, it cost 100, I'm now paying 80. And it's a very different skill set and different set of questions to be asking people, but also trying to translate that back into an EBITDA saving when we go back to our boards and our CFOs and say, this is what procurement have done to justify our existence. Because a straightforward cost saving like for like is a nice easy metric that people can relate to. Cost avoidance is a bit harder when you then factor in the sustainability. It's another layer of education, really.
That was fascinating, because now cost is multidimensional. There's other factors there like risk, like carbon emissions, and ultimately what the boards care about is the EBITDA figure. It's what it shows on the P&L, and all the great work you're doing in reducing risk, which shows up on the P&L later down the line. It doesn't show up now. Or the impact of carbon emissions to your customer perception. Those things don't show up. So, and they're trade-offs that you have to manage. So that's really, really interesting there, Natasha. Ewan, my question for you: how does leadership team at Morgan Sindall calculate cost savings? What are some of your 2024 cost-saving goals, and how do you ensure that these goals are attainable?
So we kind of approach it in a slightly funny way. The way that we're looking at it is a maintenance of a margin overall as a kind of UK business, and then separately as the regional setups that we have. So within a region, you might have multiple projects running through a year, and you are awarding packages out of them at various points, but they're all based on the original specification. Would say that we've got really good kind of engineers and designers and our quantity surveyors and the teams who manage that from kind of day one and through the tender process. We're not chasing the bottom line. We're definitely looking much more as a kind of value add within the whole business. So that is factoring things like Natasha's been mentioned already, that taking into account the risk and the availability, but also a huge focus on things like sustainability and social value. With a lot of the frameworks and the clients that we're operating with, we've got quite strict regulations that we have to abide by for that, in terms of the performance of a building or a school, for example, how long these products are going to be working at their highest percentage for, and what kind of performance they get when you actually you hand over for kind of use at the time. So we have to factor all of that into it. So it might be that you have a budget for a specific package of work that you are going to then work with one or more subcontractors on. And then you work with the suppliers as well and the manufacturers, and you end up with this kind of like three-way conversation that happens around it to try and, I suppose, you create that value by having that conversation, and hopefully that value gives you a better product for the cost that you've got, or helps to lower that cost as well. And so we are try to kind of maintain that margin, and roughly speaking, the margin's somewhere around about 2 to 3% across the board. If you exceed that, then that's fantastic. But it doesn't happen all the time, certainly, and there's going to be certain times that your procurement figure that you present at the point where you're rewarding everything, it tells one story, and then when you get to the end of the project, there's a completely different story, because there's snagging, or there's been issues with quality or something else like that that's not necessarily captured at that. It is a procurement and a supply chain issue within that, but it will come off the contingency or the margin at the end, and it's not necessarily attributable. So our senior leadership and the regional heads are all working within their groups to make sure that this is kind of monitored as well as it possibly can be. And there's a kind of good setup in terms of that to make sure that we're communicating that kind of fairly regularly. Weekly and monthly meetings that are set in stone, and a lot of conversations that happen with contractors, even while they're still on site, and even while they're delivering things that we've already awarded them, that we're looking to make sure that we're still getting the value out of it. And if there is anything that can be changed at that stage, then we're making sure that we do it so long, and delivering the best product that we possibly can.
Fantastic thing. Alex, same question or similar question for you. How is cost savings calculated at ACS, and how is your cost saving? How's your cost savings targets calculated every year, and what's the biggest impact that procurement has in the company from achieving those savings?
Yeah, so we're kind of in a similar position of a combination of the two previous, really. Last year, we had a very simple process, again, similar to Natasha, where we looked at the last price paid versus the newest price paid, and did a very simple math sum to say we've saved X amount against that product. But then on the other hand, we're also measured at program level. So depending on the budget within the program, have you achieved the expected cost savings, or at least achieved the cost that you've expected to achieve at the bid stage, which is where you've accepted a percentage saving maybe on a previous product or a similar product. This year we've taken a very different approach, because I think it's very key when you think about cost savings. Is it's all well and good to turn around to anyone within a business, the board especially, and say, I've saved £1 million this year, because the first question you'll get back is, okay, what about the price increases? So what we've looked at doing this year is actually implement a whole new process of looking at our cost savings. And what we do is every year, and most businesses will do this, we'll put an escalation percentage on their material costs. So as an example, we might bid something in 2024, but the program delivery might be for 2025, 2026, for example. So to ensure that your costs are covered, you'll put an escalation percentage in to say, right, next year there'll be a 6% escalation cost on materials. So what we actually do now is we measure our total material variance as opposed to cost savings. So what that will do is give you a net figure at the end to say your pluses and minuses equate to this figure at the end. So just an example, this year we put a 10% escalation in, given that the world is a volatile place and no one really knows quite what's going on right now. And we're able to say 4 months into the year that we're tracking at 7.2%. So within that, there's £250,000 of savings that I can report back to the business and say, great, we've saved £250,000 for this business. However, there's also increases that net off to a 7.2% increase. So our cost savings targets are a little bit strange in our business, because we look at the budget of each program. Are we achieving that? Yes or no? And of course, we want cost savings within that business as well. But ultimately, what we're looking at is we're being cost conscious as opposed to necessarily just focusing on savings and saying, are we staying within the remit that we gave ourselves as a business to ensure that that final figure at the end of the year is not far beyond what we forecast for that year.
So accuracy. It's all about accuracy of whatever targets that you set. So therefore, you monitor material variance like a hawk, and then you add that in as the buffer to cost.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
absolutely. And the key there is that, you can do it in a manual way. The way that we managed to do this now is fully automated at the click of a button. So what we can do is very quickly report back into the business, almost live, to say, right, okay, we're starting to creep towards that 10%. What do we need to do? Now that may then instigate different actions within the business and within the procurement team to say, okay, we now need to look at another lower cost source, or do we focus on commodity pricing? And then actually what you do is start to target areas of the business which are negatively impacting that additional percentage increase that's starting to get you to the point where you're then in uncontrolled spend and potentially causing negative effects on your P&L at the end.
This is a great tip to everyone in the audience about financial planning accuracy. This is what the C-suite care about. When procurement can start talking in this language and understanding these pain points that C-suite and CFOs have, accuracy of financial planning, then procurement gets a seat at the table. So just before we continue to the next question, we had a question from Ujwal. It said, hey, I would like to understand your point of view on how we reduce the creation of new products in the ERP system. So how can we manage the PO system if the organization only creates the PO after purchasing the product? This is open to anyone here. Feel free to give some best practices, like, create the PO first, but open to anyone here on how they would respond to Ujwal's.
I would suggest you never want to be raising a PO after the event. Most businesses will always operate on a no PO, no pay basis. But strong consultation with your stakeholders, having a mature parts system so so that your ERP reflects what you regularly buy. But also working closely with projects so you know what you're going to have to go out and procure, so that actually you can build that bill of materials up front. And that's not just working with sales, it's working with engineering. It's also sometimes working with the suppliers to understand what's coming up in the marketplace. What is the latest development of X, Y, Z? How do you get more proactive rather than reactive? That's my
Brilliant.
thought.
Brilliant. Thank you, Natasha. Some great insights there. Don't raise a PO. So manage. Don't raise POs after the purchase. Okay, that's the key one. And to the audience, please drop a comment on the point about cost savings and how you feel about the targets you've been set by your C-suite. And if you have any questions to the panel about and any advice you'd ask them to achieve those targets, we've got 3 experts here. Let's use them. Next question for Natasha. The post-PO management process can have a pretty major impact on cost savings. Let's start with train wrecks. What's your biggest post-PO management train wreck story? What are you doing differently as a result of this train wreck? And how did this train wreck impact the cost savings targets that you set?
So rather than go to a specific one, because of the environment I work in, but also the background of where I've worked, I'm going to call on some generic ones that I've seen across the history of my career. The general root cause of train wrecks is usually a lack of clarity. We've all sat there when we're told sales have sold something, can we now therefore just go and deliver? You sit in a meeting with suppliers trying to agree what you're going to buy from them to enable the eventual outcome. But actually, there's a lack of clarity. And especially going back to the previous point from the person who said about having to do retrospective POs, the number of times we know that it's something big and square and grey, but we don't know whether that's a concrete block or whether it's a key for a laptop, for example. And I would say lack of specificity, lack of clarity cause so many of these problems. And you raise a PO thinking that you've got a really tight contract, you've got a really good bill of materials, you've specified everything. You then get into delivery and you suddenly uncover all sorts of unknowns that haven't been factored into the contract, haven't been factored into the bid, and suddenly between the prime and all the sub-tier contractors, you're all sitting there pointing at one another going, well, it's not my fault, it's not my fault, so who's going to bear the liability for that? Who's got the contingency? And so that causes major train wrecks in terms of not doing that due diligence and taking the time to plan up front. That causes no end of problems for me on a post-PO world. The second one is often the speed. So within procurement, we're forever being criticised for our lack of agility, especially thinking of Ewan's world within construction, when you've got multiple subcontractors beneath, multiple tiers of subcontractors. You can often find that the suppliers are writing their change controls faster than you're able to write your change controls into the customer. And then suddenly you're left in a position that you've written change controls that vastly outweigh the change you're receiving back from the customer. And so you have a huge work in progress that's a major cost to the business, and your C-suite are sitting there going, well, hold on a minute, we weren't meant to be negative at this point, what's going on? Both of those scenarios really cause chaos for procurement and really impact the perception of procurement. And it doesn't matter how many savings you're dealing with over here, if there's lots of noise from the programs after contract, that can really devalue all of that. And for me, I would always say it's all about the planning and it's all about the consultation and building in a contingency factor, but also planning how are you going to manage change and what timelines are you going to agree internally and externally, and also with your customer, so that you don't build up a massive whip behind you.
Do you put that into your supplier contracts? That specifically that bit about change. What happens in XYZ event? How a change process is going to be managed, especially with POs, with so many POs changing. Do you build it?
We're trying to.
Yeah.
It's an evolution.
Yeah, not easy. Ewan, my question for you: can you tell me about a time when a post PO miss, so something didn't come on time, negatively impacted your cost savings? Why did this happen? Looking back, what's the one thing you and your team wish you had done differently? And then, Lauren, I promise we're going to come to your question. It looks like a good question, so we'll come to that straight afterwards.
Yeah, to be honest, there's quite a few, certainly the teams that I've been part of, that these things, you get a lot of misses. Sometimes it's something you've done directly, other times it's something that's completely unavoidable. And I think the one that springs to mind, we probably had it was an impact that we had coming out of supply chain issues. We had stuff, we had product coming in from overseas, and that ended up getting caught up in the Suez Canal blockages. That was that was a couple of years ago now. But we had. I'll put it this way: we put too many eggs in one basket, and too many eggs that were due to be delivered at the same time. And what happened was
To save costs.
Yeah. Going out on a block of products, so it was two different varieties of the same product coming from the same manufacturer. That manufacturer happened to be in Western Australia, and everything had been fine prior to that. There was no kind of indication that there would go anything wrong. We knew that we were slightly stretching the supplier by doing this, but we had enough confidence that we'd built in time into the deliveries that a block were coming first, and then the next set, and then the next set, and there was enough of a gap between them that we'd built a bit of fat into the plan. But I think unfortunately the circumstances conspired against us, and we ended up with a handful of this product sitting on the back of a ship waiting to go through the Suez Canal, and then no way of offloading it once it actually got free of that. Ended up going right the way through the Mediterranean and docked at Rotterdam before we could get anything off the container. And once we got it from there, we could get it into the UK, but ultimately that cost us probably in the region of about 6 to 8 weeks. And I think there was nothing we could do. There was no way of doing anything with this, with it stuck on the back of a container ship, and there was no blame to apportion to the supplier for that at all. And what actually happened was that the next batch that were coming had enough to cover us our immediate requirements, but we then ended up having to air freight these. Not a product that you wanted to air freight, very heavy, very bulky, and everybody was, and the problem at the same time was that the cost of air freight was going up because of what was happening in the sea freight and the logistics industry. So we ended up massively eating into our kind of projected savings across 2 projects, but we massively ate into these projected savings because we then had to basically say, right, well, we're going to air freight the next 2 or 3 of these so that we don't negatively impact the projects that these are going on to any further. We just about got away with it in terms of client delivery dates and things like that, but unfortunately, yeah, there was a bit of an issue, and that was that was a big problem. But again, it's one of these things you look back at and go, right, we can't learn anything. We can learn plenty from it. No one's fault, but actually what we need to do next time is either schedule these better or make sure that we're not so held into one particular relationship. We need to make sure that we've got alternatives, and we make sure that we're not forcing everything down one route because of this kind of saving that we think we're going to get out of it.
I think the last point is really key, is understanding your single points of failure and understanding where those choke points could be.
Absolutely.
Alex, question for you. Just before we get to that question, Lauren's question, would love your feedback on this. How do you manage that sinking feeling of reporting in your cost savings and avoidances only to know that these have been eaten up by factors that you have no part in?
I think that's a question that we all ask, I think. And we all sit there with that dreaded feeling of an expectation from the business of, hitting a certain number. But I think the key there is to be fully transparent with the business throughout the process, and also have your facts straight with everything that you're doing, where when you're reporting anything to anyone in the business is to be sure that what you're doing is not making an excuse for a failure, but is actually to be completely factual and evidence anything that you believe has had an impact, but deliver that in the sense of, oh, it wasn't my fault because of X. It's a case of laying the facts out in terms of, key failures within the supply chain or key global issues that numerous businesses have come across. And by laying out that evidence and that factual stuff ahead of time, and not just holding that in your back pocket until the last minute that you report that information, but feeding that information into the key stakeholders within the business as key things happen. And if you're managing your risk, you should be doing that anyway, right? But if you're not, then you need to be the one that's proactive within your business to highlight up or sideways, whatever position you sit in, to say, look, guys, this is having an impact on what I'm able to do within this business. Now, right now, you might not know that as a figure, but what you will do at some point then is be able to attribute that to potentially missing an objective that you've been set or that you've even set yourself. So by tying the two together, you can be very clear with the business in a non-excuse-led way to say, here are the facts, here's the figures that go with it. Let's then look at the actions that we need to do next time to mitigate that from being the same thing next year.
Brilliant. Alex, the question is, what does the post-PO management process mean to you? And can you tell me a story about the time you or someone in your team had about a big miss that impacted a customer delivery or could have impacted customer delivery, How did this big miss impact you, and what did you do to try and resolve it? I'm hoping you're going to share the story you've told me before.
Is this the incinerator story?
Yeah, this is the cutting a hole in a ship,
Yeah,
inside of a ship.
absolutely. So, first of all, I mean, Ewan, I was in exactly the same position as yourself. You pretty much, I could have said that story word for word in the position that I was in around the Suez Canal. So, I think it's key that there's probably hundreds of us that could use that in any interview, in any question answer that we've ever come across. So, it's brilliant to hear that I wasn't the only one that was crying every night trying to get my stuff in. Um, but yeah, I mean, post PO management is a completely different process in every business because it really depends on the business strategy, whether you're in, low volume bespoke manufacturing, if you're in, slightly simpler but higher volume manufacturing. So the particular instance that Anam, I know you're referring to is a scenario where I worked for a business at the time that was in the marine industry. We were doing waste systems for large ships. And one of those waste systems was a large incinerator that, was probably the size of two cars or a small bus. And it was pretty epic in terms of actually getting that manufactured at a subcontractor and then making sure they were hitting all the deadlines they needed to fit that into a ship before they actually welded the side of this ship up. Now, we did our standard PO management process, which is, we're 3-4 weeks away from delivery. Let's just pick the phone up and have a nice conversation with our supplier and say, right, everything on track for that date? Yes, of course. Next week, you do the exact same thing. What you're not really doing is managing that purchase order, is you're just taking someone's word for the fact that they're saying they're going to hit a date, irrespective of the fact they may have a million issues behind them that could be potentially delaying that. Now, what happened in this scenario was about a week before that final deadline of sealing that ship up, we had that call with the supplier. They said, no, sorry, we're actually going to be delayed by about 3 or 4 weeks. It is what it is. Now, I can't remember the exact figures at the time, but I think it was somewhere in the region of 150 to 200,000 euros to recut a new hole in the side of the ship. So what that actually meant was I ended up flying all the way to Germany to go and visit this supplier and sit down with them for 2 days to go through their entire production plan to try and make them achieve that date that we had. Because unfortunately for us, we weren't commercially protected enough to turn around and say, well, you're going to pay that cost, because we hadn't done our pre-PO strategy well enough to say, okay, what are the risks involved in this potential program, and what could the potential cost be, and how do we protect ourselves from that? So fortunately, we got to the end result of it being delivered, but not only did it cost us time, it cost us effort. People are out of the business, but what it did is highlight a huge risk failure in the business to say, how many other potential issues are there within the supply chain that could relate back to this as an example, to say, okay, it's not necessarily causing you a direct cost saving, or a direct cost, not a saving, should I say, but more back to Natasha's point about that entire cost of the full life cycle of actually from the requirement through to delivery and all the things that come between, that actually that could have been a hidden cost within the business of 200,000 euros that, the next person to purchase it wouldn't see that cost because it would be attributed by finance into another bucket somewhere, not directly to actually your material purchasing. So the post PO management process needs to be defined in a way that means you've got clear, detailed instructions from your suppliers and a way of managing that risk based on the criticality of that to your business at the same time.
Thanks, Alex. And the reason that story always shocks me is you had to go to your supplier's facility, go sit
Mm-hmm.
with them, and tell them how to do manufacturing. And you're a supply chain guy, not a
Yeah.
manufacturing guy. Uh, so yeah, well done getting that done. You could have costed 300,000 in liquidated damages. Ewan, my question for you is, what's no Natasha, sorry. Question back for you is transitioning to a positive post PO management example. Alex gave a good one there, which was almost a crisis. They turned it around. Could you tell me about a time you or your team were able to get a big win from something that they did in the post PO process?
Yeah, so I'm going to use an example that's not ERP driven and not necessarily directly PO driven. So, a while ago, um, you notice I didn't say how many years experience I've had in procurement. I've given up doing that now because it just frightens me. But a while ago in my career, I was looking after a supplier who unfortunately went into the equivalent of Chapter 11. Bankruptcy protection, we were post-contract, we were in the middle of delivery. It was a very long contract cycle. Because we were looking at the supplier not just on a day-to-day basis and a delivery basis, but monitoring them all the way through. We were aware of their financial difficulties. We built really good relationships with their senior management. So actually we had monthly reviews with their CEO, looking at their financials. We were reviewing on an ongoing basis the debt, what was going on. So when they did go into Chapter 11, they phoned up very early that morning to tell us what was happening. I went straight into the yard, spoke to the management team who we'd been liaising with all the way through on our side. We had protections ready to protect people on site, as well as looking to try and retain the supplier. We also had contingencies with other suppliers available if we needed. We were hoping not to have to invoke them, but we were there doing that just in case of scenario A, scenario B, scenario C. It was probably the most exciting week in my career, because I think I arrived on the Tuesday to be told about them going into Chapter 11. Literally a few hours later, I was sitting with the supply chain director. We were going through all the contingencies, what we were doing, had a call with the management team at the other end, and they said, oh, we'd like to introduce you to our new buyers. Sorry it's taken us so long. And we're going, yeah, this is not long. This is a couple of hours. We're still catching up here. Within 2 days, we flew out to go and meet the new owners, work through the metrics we would need to see, the assurances, the level of transparency we would require. We were back out again a week later, taking our customer with us to assure them and understand all the checks and balances. And what it meant was we were able to continue service so that actually the supply on the ground wasn't interrupted at any point. There were a lot of late nights and a lot of hairy moments for the rest of us, sort of thinking, oh my goodness, and is this the right thing to be doing? Should we be invoking the contingency and bringing somebody in? In terms of the cost to us at the time, it was a lot of management cost, a lot of management time spent reassuring the customer, managing the supply chain, reaching back into the wider corporation for people with much, much, much deeper financial knowledge than myself, going through all the key metrics, making sure we were really scrutinising the monthly and quarterly accounts as they came through. That went on probably for at least another year. But what it did do was allow the job to proceed without impacting on other subcontracts, without impacting on the overall delivery. And I would say that that planning and subcontract management was the real positive out of that enabled us to have, we averted massive costs, not just in terms of liquidated damages, if we'd have been late or we'd delayed other work packages, but also the cost of having to start again with new drawings, new models, before we even got into the manufacturing side of things. And I think for me, one of the key lessons is always, it's so much easier to deal with an issue at the early stages. So if you're in design, you're looking at possibly 1 nought. If you're into modelling, you're looking at 2 noughts. By the time you get into manufacturing, it's an awful lot more noughts behind there, and the factors just increase exponentially. And so it's very much trying to have that ongoing management, that knowledge and that oversight. And Alex said it earlier, it's planning for risk.
It's planning for risk, yeah. Brilliant. Ewan, question for you is, what's your most successful post-PO management process story, and how did this impact your cost savings? And for the audience, Would love to hear any details of a story of a miss, orders not arriving on time, anything. They always make for good stories. But over to you, Ewan.
Oh, definitely. So this is a kind of collective story, I suppose, in one of the teams that I was working for. That had a relatively quiet year in the business, and it came down to kind of probably quarter 4, and all of a sudden, as these things tend to happen, is that we had 3 or 4 projects drop at once, and there was a push in the business to try and be able to kind of recognise as much revenue as they could so that it could be reported within the financial year. And what that meant is that once it rolled down from them through the kind of like checks and balances through our engineering department, it landed at procurement's feet, and it was down to us to kind of make sure that we could get everything on order. And it was, like I say, it was 3 or 4 projects at once, and getting doing as much as we possibly could with the suppliers and in the supply chain to create these purchase orders, get everything out, and get them all confirmed as well, with a very short window of time in which to do it. So I was working with a good team, which is always a help. A lot of people who were very committed and willing to put the hours in and the time and the effort in to really do this, and it highlighted how we'd actually managed to kind of get our kind of strategy right in a lot of respects, because what we were doing is that we were placing these orders, and there was a lot of orders going out, and as they were going out, they were being reviewed, and then they were being reviewed additionally at a kind of higher level. So when the buyers were putting them out, I was making sure that I was across what was and wasn't confirmed. And actually, as we went through, it became clear that there was a lot of repeat orders that we tried to group together as much as we possibly could. And of course, some things have slipped the net, and other things had to go out in different orders, and there were multiple PO lines and things being changed all the time. And actually, the success story that came out of it was we started to look at the procurement of a block of these items in a different way. That instead of bringing them in as required, we started looking at stock holding, which the business hadn't done for quite a while. They'd had bad experiences in the past, and they'd sunk a lot of money and lost cost through that because of over ordering or ordering unnecessary items. So there was a lot of review work done within the procurement team to understand which were the repeat parts, and a lot of work done with internal stakeholders to make sure that actually we're going to get this sign off from all of them. We're going to get our engineering and design work signed off to say, yeah, these are the parts that we're going to make sure that we specify, and we'll get the sign off from our finance team to say that we were going to make sure that we were able to stay up to date with the payments as we needed them to be. And that led into a huge amount of data being produced, and we assessed, and we came up with a block of items to then start to create a stock of. And what that actually ended up on the end is that we took about 15% out of the costs of these items, and that was partly attributable to the projects that we'd been working through, but also as a kind of forward saving, because we knew that we were going to have these in hand ahead of the orders that were due to come in the following year. So it made a huge impact, and actually in some respects that maybe the unseen saving within that was not only a better process that we'd created, but also we avoided the supply chain disruption potentially that could have come through the following 6 months. And this was around the time that the war in Ukraine was kicking off as well, and there was multiple issues within the supply chain. So by doing that, we did, I suppose, insulate ourselves from the risk slightly. So there's that kind of there's that intangible saving that you can't really quantify it properly, but it's definitely there. And there was like I say, a massive positive and a really like huge hit for the team as well. So it was a collective effort, and like it was I think we got the rewards for putting the hard yards in.
Fantastic, thanks. So last question each, something for the audience to go away with. Alex, first question for you is, what advice do you have for those listening in today who don't have a good expanded PO management process in place, but want to improve this as part of their supply chain in 2024?
I think the key there is to start at the end, and understand what is it that what is the objective? What are you trying to achieve in terms of gaining a better understanding within your business? That for me, there's two key streams there. One of them is increased visibility and control from within your supply chain and procurement team, and the other one is increased visibility outwards from your team into the rest of the business. So then by understanding those two key streams of information for you, you can start to work your way back and understand, okay, where are the gaps in what I'm actually trying to achieve here? So as an example, when I joined ACS, we had a lot of information within the supply chain team, but not a huge amount of information being given out to the business. So we implemented visual management boards and implemented additional data reports that could go out to the rest of the business to show the purchase order management process, to say, okay, you've got X number of orders, they're coming in on these dates, does, that supports, but that doesn't. So here's where the focus is going to be on the business. So if you don't have that process in place right now, understand from within your team and the rest of the team, your internal customers, what is it that you're trying to actually achieve, and then work back from that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Natasha, question for you. The three most important changes you've made to improved post-PO management. How and where does technology fit into your strategy? And how have you been able to generate real cost savings from expanded PO management?
So for me, it's very much about engagement, early engagement, and we can add value. Bring us late to the party, and we're always going to be in reaction mode. So very much try and be in from the very outset. When the bid's being prepared, engaging with the suppliers, constantly trying to understand what the desired outcome is, but also what's the best possible technical solution, working with the technical experts. And I've not used visual boards before, but I love that idea, so I'm going to steal with pride from Alex on that one and say that's one I will adopt. I'm a big proponent of Power BI. I love using data to try and drive decisions, but also show the impact. Never thought about it, though, in that context, so I'm going to go and upset my analyst now by asking her to build me something for that, Alex, so thank you. And it's really using the technology to model what's likely to happen, and how do we bring things in on time, what contingency have you got, and then how do you plan for the unknown. Alex and Ewan have both spoken about the Suez Canal and everything getting stopped. So we've had the occasion when the ship got stuck there and blocked entry. We've also had occasions recently where there's not enough water to let the deeper vessels go through. It's something that's going to happen more and more. So really for me, it's how do we build in a factor for disruption? How do we make sure that business continuity, disaster recovery is built in? It's the first thing everyone wants to take out, is that contingency for risk. And for me, it's really trying to use the technology to demonstrate the impact of that risk, but also that it's been thought through, and you've established the impact, but you've established the probability of this happening based on whatever metrics, history you can find, because people find it very easy to deal with what they perceive to be light and fluffy. But as soon as you give them data with history and qualitative assessments, it's very hard to argue with that. And when you have that probability calculation in there with data driving it and behind it, that really helps for me. And it's a very different skill set in the post-PO world. It's not one we often think about. It's one we need to include upfront in the pre-PO world as well as in the post-PO. And then it is money that you can gradually release as those risks don't materialise, hopefully. or you keep it in a pot for the end of the project for the completely unforeseen that nobody saw coming.
Or a bonus for procurement and supply chain for managing their risks really well.
Exactly, which is always a good way to motivate
Yes,
people.
definitely, definitely. Ewan, final question for you. How have you, a similar question to the last one, but if there's anything else you want to share, how have you been able to generate real cost savings from expanded PO management?
I think it's just the example I've used before is a very good example of it as well. But I think more generically, I think you are. I think you're getting away from this idea of once your PO is placed, you can essentially just put it to one side and it will kind of just deal with itself. And I think Alex and Natasha have both talked about this as well. Is this you getting away from this idea of you're one and done. It's you do need to be managing it in. You need to be keeping an eye on dates. You need to be liaising with stakeholders. You need to be speaking to suppliers and contractors. You want to be sure that at all points during it, no matter how far ahead your delivery dates are, that you're across it and that you know that as soon as anything were to change, and that can be a positive change or it can be a negative change, that you get that at the point that it happens rather than months down the line when it's too late to do anything about it. And that's part of your management of that, and you're going to pick and choose slightly on this as well, depending on your volume of orders and your number of lines. But you're going to be able to identify suppliers in your supply chain who there's a greater risk profile attached to. You're going to identify products that are going to have a greater impact should anything go wrong with them, and those are the orders that you're going to choose to focus on more, so not leaving the other ones completely, but these are the ones you're going to end up with monthly meetings or fortnightly or weekly meetings as the dates draw closer. These are the ones that you're monitoring this with the internal stakeholders to make sure that there aren't any scope changes and that anything is captured, and that's how you're managing it in, and it's less of a saving off the bottom line, but it's certainly a cost avoidance. And I think we probably have to stop looking at them as two different things. Is that is a saving? It's just a different terminology for it. It's just as important for the business to avoid costs going up as it is to actually taking the costs or a percentage out of it in the first place. So we got to presenting that as data of our savings included the cost avoidance as well. So we would say, right, well, here's the budget cost. That was the purchase cost, but actually this is what it might have been had we not done it, or this is what we saved by having this conversation. So it's doing that and generating that positive outcome, and it's an all round thing. It's you do get that value, you get that cost avoidance, you reduce your risks, and all round that makes for a considerably happier procurement team, but as a positive knock-on effect, you get much happier stakeholders who are willing to kind of keep you engaged and bring you in earlier the next time because they know what you can deliver.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ewan. So I want to say a massive thank you to all of our speakers, Alex, Natasha, and Ewan. Closing remarks from me is, one is I think there's a lot of great wisdom shared here, and there's definitely an understanding that the way that post-PO works has to change because the world has changed. And lots of great strategies talked about today. So looking forward to continuing this series. Join me next Thursday, May the 16th at 3 p.m. UK time for a discussion on LinkedIn about how manufacturers can resolve the proportion of PO management that never gets done in a manual environment. Next, if you'd like to learn more about our post-PO AI agent so you never miss a critical order from suppliers, feel free to DM us. We've got lots of exciting things being released in the next 30 days. So once again, thank you to everyone, and thank you for joining us. Speak soon.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.